I'd like for you to picture an anime. The anime is a police procedural show centered around a police unit filled with colorful characters. The anime is spent following this group of characters on both their day-to-day activities as well as the various cases they have to solve throughout the week. The anime is set in the near future where technology has allowed advanced robotics to become integrated within everyday life. The main hook of the series is that the police force make extensive use of the robotics whenever a crime needs to be solved. These crimes will often be political in nature, and the series will use these plots to mediate their relevant themes. While there is no set protagonist, the obvious audience surrogate is a fresh-faced rookie police girl, the heroine's signature physical attributes being her short boyish haircut and bright eyes. She is also defined by her strong-willed personality and her idealistic view of the world. Though the anime is ostensibly a mecha anime, it opts for a far more realistic tone in how it handles the various trends and tropes found within the genre, to the point that it can be seen as a wholesale deconstruction. Giant robots and the teams assigned to them are treated less like heroes and more like a big-budget security force having to navigate bureaucracy and budget cuts and carefully plan out every maneuver to avoid casualties. So have you got the anime pictured in your mind's eye yet? If so, you will know what it is. And if you haven't pictured it already, just read the title of this video.
2号車開始を終わりました。ただ1号車はちょっと。1号車どうした？泉何をグズグズしとる？やだやだやだ。こんなとこから飛んだらアルバンスが壊れちゃうよ。
KYOTO ビデオ
続発するレイバー犯罪に警視庁は本庁警備部内に特殊車両2課を創設してこれに対抗した。通称特殊2課パトロールレイバー中隊パトレイバーの誕生である。
Patlabor is a franchise that is such a stone-cold classic that it feels impossible to not come across a person who hasn't at least heard of it. The franchise's shadow stretches far and wide across the modern anime landscape with how it influenced mecha and science fiction anime for the past 30 years. It also feels like anime's best-kept secrets. While people know of Patlabor, you would be hard-pressed to come across someone who considers themselves a part of the Patlabor fandom. At least in America. In Japan, Patlabor was an instant smash hit that has consistently made money hand over fist. Japanese otaku consider its release to be a game changer for the medium on the same level as Gundam and Evangelion. Yet for some reason, in spite of efforts from both Japanese and American companies, the franchise never really caught fire over here in the United States of A. Unlike with Evangelion, which still draws scores of new fans in every day, Patlabor's American fanbase is comparatively small. Back in the day, Central Park Media paid a large amount for the license, only to see sales be below their expectations, causing them to abandon localizing the entire franchise after their releases of the OVA and TV series flopped. Patlabor has only just recently gotten a visible fanbase, but it's still quite niche compared to the fanbases of other anime classics. But if there is anybody who knows their salt about anime, chances are that they are a Patlabor fan. It's definitely an anime critic's anime. In a way, Patlabor occupies the same space as Legend of the Galactic Heroes, an anime franchise that's held in high regard by those in the know, and every anime fan and their mother swear up and down that they'll get around to it someday. But here's the thing, Patlabor has never been more easier to get into these days. At the time of this recording, you can get the entire franchise box set on Blu-ray for a cool $75 on Right Stuff's website. As long as you have the dough handy, there's nothing stopping you from getting into the franchise. No $500 limited editions here, Sentai. But then that raises the question, where do you start? Do you start with the OVA, the movie, the TV series, the other OVA, the other movie that's early 2000s personified, the live action movie, the Axia cassette commercial? The answer is, of course, the obvious one, Today's video will mostly focus on the first OVA and the history leading up to it. The other Patlabor titles will get their own videos dedicated to them at a future date. For now, discussing the original OVA and what makes it great is more than enough material to extract evidence as to why you should finally get around to watching Patlabor. It really is the best introduction to the characters, themes, and overall conceit that paints the franchise as a whole. Everything I described at the beginning of this video is all there and more in this OVA. But let's get right down to it before I labor this introduction any longer. Patlabor's history leading up to the OVA is easily one of the most fascinating aspects of the franchise. The franchise was born not out of the brain of a singular creator nor a studio, but rather a small collective of artists. It all begins with manga author MASAMI YUKI. In the early 80s, Yuki and fellow manga artist Tomato Aki would regularly have coffee with each other and discuss the state of giant robot anime in those days. The topic that came up the most, naturally, was how all the most popular mecha anime titles were being helmed by Yoshiyuki Tomino, whose series were defined by high drama, angst, and lots upon lots of character death. Yuki wanted to see if it were possible to make an anime that was the complete opposite of all of that, one that eschewed angst and character deaths and instead embraced the mundane. In other words, a slice of life anime with giant robots. Between 1981 to 1985, Yuki hashed out a few concepts that used this idea as their centerpiece. The first concept, constructed around 1981, was called J-Lizard. Set in the middle of an interstellar war, the show was to be set on board a training ship. Yuki's main hope for the show was that the main protagonist was to be a young girl, which was very uncommon for mecha anime at the time. No actual concept art for J-Lizard has been found, as it was never fully developed nor pitched to any studios, though Yuki would carry over the idea of a female protagonist to future concepts. In 1982, Yuki created another concept called Lightning Garakris. The setting is the far-flung future where planet Earth is in the process of colonizing new planets. However, the process has hit a snag thanks to a labor shortage. Our protagonist is a worker for hire named Aldi Rhyme who works for Rhyme Active Services. She promises to take on any job no matter how tough or dangerous, which is made all the easier thanks to her giant robot, Garakris. Though Lightning Garakris got further along in development than J-Lizard, as evidenced by the fact that concept art exists of it, it was never pitched to any studio. This was because Yuki scrapped the entire project when he realized that Garakris looked similar to Walker Gallia, a robot from the then currently airing series Sento Mecha Zabungle. After getting his Scrungles zabungled, Yuki came back with another concept called Vidor. Out of all the concepts, this one was in the oven the longest, between 1982 to 1985. The space and planet colonization concept was kept from Garakris, but instead of work for hire, Aldi Rhyme was now a policewoman who has just been transferred to the new traffic control division in the POPS 110 precinct. She is teamed up with her new partners, another young woman named Epiluna Micro, and the main robot, the titular Vidor. The Vidor pitch is where the concept of labors, humanoid robots used for heavy work, come into being. It's also where Yuki fleshed out Aldi's personality, imagining her as a short-haired feisty tomboy. Specifically, he drew a lot of inspiration from Dirty Pairs K in her conception. Yuki was able to get a lot more people on board to help clean up and flesh out this pitch. One of them was mecha designer YUTAKA IZUBUCHI. He fell in love with the idea and helped assemble a team to write a 26-episode pitch for Vidor, alongside a small dummy proposal to better their chances of getting their foot in the door. Sadly, the studio they pitched Vidor to, Sunrise, wasn't biting on either one of the pitches, so it was back to the drawing board. After the Vidor pitch failed, Yuki put the project on ice while he focused more on his manga career, but Izubuchi was still willing to see this project to fruition, so he enlisted in the help of screenwriter Kazunori Ito. Like Izubuchi, Ito also fell in love with the idea and immediately applied his hand to it. Instead of taking place in the far-out future, Ito changed the setting to be in the more recent future, taking place on Earth in Tokyo, Japan, after a devastating earthquake and the polar ice caps melting necessitated the innovation of the labors. He also gave the concept its new name, Patlabor. Ito also recruited his wife, character designer AKEMI TAKADA, to help redesign the characters. By this point, Alt D Rhyme was now going by the name Celia Saotome. It was Takada that developed and finalized the designs of both her and the rest of the Patlabor crew. Saotome was given a new name that she would now be known as, Noa Izumi. In 1986, an acquaintance of Ito's who worked at Bandai Visual noticed that Yuki's manga were quite popular and knew of his and the rest of his team's pitch that they had been working on for the past few years. A contract was drawn up that offered the team a chance to produce a 6-part OVA, so long as Yuki produced a manga version as a tie-in for said OVA. The 4 members of the team agreed to the deal. They all decided that they should form their own independent production team so that all 4 of them owned the copyrights and weren't beholden to some big studio. Now, all they need now is a director! Right from the very start, all 4 had pinned Mamoru Oshii as a potential candidate, as all 4 of them were friends of his. Both Takada and Ito had shared a few production credits with him prior to Patlabor, but they also had their doubts. For one, Oshii was currently on the outs with the industry after the failure of Angel's Egg last year. The team also doubted his abilities to work on a hard sci-fi story. Urusei Yatsura was fantastical to the nth degree, and Dallos, while being slightly more realist, still delved into the more speculative side of science fiction. The team was also all too familiar with Oshii's writing quirks. Reportedly, Izubuchi said that he did not want to create a show that would turn out to be nothing more than a bad dream in the end. However, Oshii was very much interested in this project and was perfectly willing to go along with the rest of the team. He was also completely broke at the time, so that helped. On December of 1986, the now team of 5 accepted the deal with Bandai Namco, and so they formed their new collective, Headgear. Before they started on Patlabor, Headgear's first project was a short OVA called Twilight Q, produced as a way to show themselves that they were totally capable of producing a 6-part OVA series, which would later become 7. We'll talk more about Twilight Q in its own video sometime in the future. From there, Headgear, along with the help of animation company Studio Deen, would produce the Patlabor OVA just in time for the first episode's release on April 22nd, 1988. So how exactly did Patlabor become the huge success that it would be known as? Well, it wasn't easy. One of the first decisions made in the creation of this OVA was Yuki determining that the OVA was not going to be an adaptation of the then current manga he was creating. This is because Yuki figured out if the OVA was going to be a page-for-page adaptation of the manga, that it could give his publisher incentive to snatch the copyright out from under Headgear. While they share the same worlds and characters, the Patlabor manga and the Patlabor OVA operate within 2 separate timelines. This will not be the last time the Patlabor franchise does this. So, both Oshii, Ito, and the rest of the team are given a little more carte blanche in how they could approach the story. It's the near future, 1998 to be more precise, and the combination of climate change and a massive earthquake has necessitated the development of large-scale industrial robots called labors as a means to retake the land from the sea. The centerpiece of this ambitious plan is the large-scale Babylon project, which is designed to completely fill Tokyo Bay and make it right for building more city on top of it. Naturally, this has led to an uptick of eco-terrorist groups who oppose the project and others like it. The actions of these groups, alongside far-right splinter groups of the JSDF, general organized crime syndicates, and your regular everyday petty thugs, have caused a rise in crime and terrorism incidents, some, if not all of them, involving labors. As a result, to combat this rise in crime, the Japanese government formed a branch of the police called the Special Vehicles Unit Section 2, SV2 for short, to combat the rise in labor crime with their own patrol labors, or Patlabors for short. The problem is that the public perception of SV2 is that they are nothing more than a money pit. Their only hangar is stationed out in the middle of nowhere, and they only consist of 2 units. Division 1's labors aren't up to scratch to even be considered for work in the field, while Division 2, our protagonists, do have high quality labors, but their dispositions aren't exactly what you would call professional. Let's meet them, shall we? First, we have Noa Izumi, our main heroine and somewhat audience surrogate. She's a spunky tomboy police girl who is a huge mecha otaku who got into the police solely for the chance to pilot a Patlabor. The downside is that she's a complete greenhorn and tends to treat her labor, whom she has named Alphonse, more like a pet than a machine.
何それ。
私のパトちゃんの名前、入隊が決まった時から考えてたんだ。
So she's the first short anime protagonist who travels around with a giant metal companion named Alphonse. Sorry, Ed. Asuma Shinohara, Izumi's command backup. He's the dispossessed fail son of the president of the company who makes the labors and is far more cynical in his outlook on life than his partner.
親父の野郎、この間の募集に勝手に応募して、その挙句自分のコネで採用まで決めやがった。って何が教育のためだ。
よっぽど信用されてなかったんだ、2代目として。
Isao Ota, Division 2 secondary pilot. He's far more experienced than Izumi and is quite the marksman. This advantage gets undercut by his hot temper and his habit of rushing into situations, guns literally ablazing as if he were an American cop. Mikiyasu Shinsi, Oda's command backup. He's far more weak-willed than Oda and is more concerned about his current domestic situation considering how much of a henpecked husband he is.
タミコさん、感情を高ぶらせたままで刃物を使うと危険ですよ。
Hiromi Yamazaki, the driver of the labors. He's a very shy and very nervous man that stands in complete contrast to his gigantic size.
はあ、彼女に弁当を作ってもらえるやつが羨ましい。
僕が作ったんです。一つ食べますか。
Keiichi Goto, Division 2's chief responsible for keeping the band of idiots in line. He is super calculating and lets on far more than he knows beneath that apathetic zombie-like exterior.
藤岡で降りたにもかかわらず、リスクの大きい自動車道にわざわざ乗り直したということは、目的地は遠距離。まずは新潟方面に向かうと見て間違いはないでしょう。
Shinobu Nagamo, Division 1's chief and abject super MILF. She's far more by the book and confident than the lax Goto, but nevertheless is willing to stand by him. She's also Mamoru Oshii's favorite character.
あの悪ガキたちも今頃は国で羽伸ばしてるわよ。
帰るとこのあるやつはいいんだけどね。
じゃあとりあえず熱いコーヒーでも入れてもらおうかな。
And last, but certainly not least, is Kanuka Clancy, a Japanese-American transfer from the NYPD. She's easily the most competent member of Division 2, mostly acting as a way to try to keep Izumi and Ota from causing too much damage. Unsuccessfully. Unlike Nagamo, Oshii actually really hates Clancy. He thought that she did not fit with the anime's dynamic due to her personality being that she's essentially the perfect police officer. And while I do like Clancy, I am inclined to agree with Oshii in that it really is the characters and their various dynamics that help drive the anime forward. Now I'm not going to say something like, instead of being about the robots, this mecha anime is about the characters. Because, newsflash, all mecha anime is about the characters. But Patlabor really is a very character-focused anime. The labors almost feel like a non-factor at most times because everything from the plots to the themes to the comedy all come down to how the characters interact with each other. Headgear gave such strong characterization to Division 2 that half the fun is just seeing how each of their personalities bounce off of each other. It's also another opportunity to see Oshii flex his funny bone that he had honed through his time on Urusei Yatsura. His sense of comedic timing and joke telling is so strong that, as loath as he may be to admit it, he can even make a seemingly perfect character like Kanuka Clancy an accessory to a truly killer punchline.
You did it.
Animation-wise, Patlabor is nothing short of spectacular. In spite of the crux of the OVA being that this is the loser police unit who barely gets to see any action on the best of days, the animators really give it their all in making what little action there is in this OVA series deliver in full. Maybe it was Oshii and Ito's involvement, but they really got the team at Studio Deen to really put 110% in animating these glorious machines in a way that makes them feel like they are part of the real world. From the abject destruction they cause, to the way their pilots draw their guns, not a smidge of detail is lost. Even outside the robots, the animators are not allowing any opportunity they could do a cool cut go to waste. Kanuka Clancy's introduction did not require her hair blowing in the wind in such a detailed manner, but those animators still did it. And the comedic animation is also on point. It's another element that you can't help but feel the influence of Oshii's time with Lum and Atsuru. Takada's character designs are also just tailor-made for those goofy expressions that hit their mark in the anime's comedic stylings thanks to Oshii's storyboarding. It's all just remarkable work from Headgear and the rest of Studio Deen. Even more when you take into account that the Patlabor staff was working with a surprisingly tight budget. Animation production was quite difficult in the making of this OVA, which shouldn't be all that shocking. Animating a robot realistically moving and breaking down would be a strain on most staffs, even with a hefty budget. But this is a team that had to deliver on the realism while also being given limited funds and a strict deadline. They were given more money for the OVA soundtrack than they were for the actual production. This restriction results in some of the anime's more inspired creative decisions. For example, Oshii actually came up with the idea of SV2's headquarters being situated in the middle of an open field on the outskirts of Tokyo as opposed to the middle of the city. This saved them from having to animate a bustling urban landscape full of cars and pedestrians every time they cut back to HQ. Traffic jams are a constant plot point because animating stationary cars is easier. The backgrounds are drawn in a more rudimentary and basic style than what was typical for OVAs at the time. The plots are set up so that SV2 are usually operating during an emergency lockdown or in the dead of night, so the streets are always completely empty. And they turn the climax of the first episode into a delicious punchline just by cutting out the potential money shots. Patlabor's production was no real walk in the park for Headgear. The reason why the 6-part OVA turned into 7 was just so that the 5 of them could get the video sale royalties that they were promised. It also is the only episode Oshii didn't direct, deferring the duties over to friend and fellow director NAOYUKI Yoshinaga. But in the end, the animation, the characters, and setting all come together nicely and meet Headgear's stated goal when they first started Patlabor: to make giant robots as boring as possible. When people hear about the deconstruction of a genre's tropes or cliches, they will usually think it means taking those narrative elements to their darkest conclusions. And while that certainly is one way to break down and examine a genre's accepted truisms, it is not the only way. Patlabor is, by all accounts, a deconstruction of the giant robot genre of anime. But their method is not by adding a blacker shade to everything. Instead, Patlabor opts for the route of completely deflating and removing any and all mystique the genre had. And it is glorious. Patlabor is all about what exactly would happen if our world had the tech for giant robots. How would our world change? And the answer is not much. The laborers are giant robots stripped of all romanticism and reduced to nothing more than just fancy forklifts. There's little difference between a typical labor and, say, a tank or an armored jeep. And while this might make the laborers effective weapons or tools, it also highlights their overall impracticality when compared to the latter vehicles. Therefore, SV2 are an incredibly situational and specialized unit who rarely, if at all, get to see any action in the field. And when they do, it's mostly just to convince the government funding this project that it totally wasn't a complete waste of taxpayers' dollars. Just like the real police.
ここから先はこの俺様がただの一歩も進ませんぞ。何言ってるんですか。行かせなきゃダメなんですよ。日暮里方向に北上させないで上の方面へ誘導するのが任務なんですから。やかましい。
The realism extends to the designs of the laborers. These aren't massive metal behemoths the size of aircraft carriers. They can only be just about as high as a 2-story building if they want to be structurally sound and not crush their own feet. All those facts combined just drive the point home that Izumi is a total weirdo in-universe for how she humanizes her labor. It's like someone calling their lawnmower Charlene. Patlabor also applies the deconstruction angle to the police by asking the question of what would happen if police behaved like hot-blooded mecha pilots. The answer to that question is that it would cause a PR disaster for the units and require them to be relieved of duty and sent back to boot camp for 2 weeks.
お前たちが乗車しとるのはグレートマジンガーか弾劾王か自閉症児や不良少年が主人公のロボットアニメじゃないんだよ。分かっとるのか本当に。
But the realism of Patlabor isn't meant to take away the excitement from the action the anime has. Rather, it can actually build on that excitement in the most unexpected ways. In episode 2, Izumi and Shinohara have to run across town to deactivate a time bomb that threatens to blow up an important meeting between Japanese and American politicians. And things get real intense when Izumi is stopped by, get this, a low bridge.
なんとかくぐれないか。
この高さじゃ無理だよ。
くそ、半端なもん作りやがって。
Even when confronted by supernatural phenomena, realism always takes the front seat. Episode 3 is centered around a potential Godzilla situation, and Division 2 spends the whole episode trying to figure out how to deal with it. And after hours of planning and back and forth, the best solution they can come up with is to try and reason with the monster.
生みの親である私に捨てられた暗い記憶の蘇ったその時に怒りに駆られて、いや私はいいんだ。この身がどうなろうと私は構わんが。
It's also important for me to mention that the realism does lead to some actual interrogation of the SV2 as an organization and for the police in general. Not as much as I would like to, mind you, it's surprisingly sparse, especially considering we have a lefty like Oshii in the cockpit, but it's still there. And in episode 6, which is the second half of a two-parter that's actually a dry run for a future Patlabor story that does better interrogate the police as an institution, Nagumo is ordered by the higher-ups to arrest Goto, all just because he has a tangible connection to the main suspect, despite no evidence showing that he's a collaborator.
もっともらしい言葉を並べてその実後藤と示し合わせ反乱部隊に内通し守備隊を煽り立てて後藤を有利に運ぼうとしとるんじゃないのか。
It ends with Nagumo standing up to her superiors and putting herself in their crosshairs when she correctly states that they are overstepping their boundaries.
ナグモはこれより独自の判断で行動します。処分なりなんなりご随に、ただし私の行動を妨げるおつもりなら今の会話のすべてを公表しますからそのおつもりで。
It's definitely a light touch with these themes, but it, along with the main cast's overall incompetence, keeps Patlabor from becoming complete propaganda. In the end, the Patlabor OVA is the perfect introduction to the franchise, not just because it's the first in the franchise and starting at the beginning is always the way to go, but because it nails right out of the gate what it set out to do. Making giant robots an ordinary, everyday occurrence. So ordinary that their very existence barely changes a thing about humanity's position in the world. And the people operating them are not heroes. They are your average working stiffs with their own set of flaws that make them both relatable human characters and great comedic players. It's mecha with all the bureaucracy and human error that you would expect from the real world. And Headgear found a way to make that concept enticing. Of course, we've only just scratched the surface of the franchise by covering this OVA. We still got plenty of more Patlabor left in the hopper that's ripe for the analyzing and the praising, but we'll save those for another day. Don't worry about me not getting to them just yet. I've been doing this gig for 4 years now. This will not be the last time we see of Izumi and Alphonse.